Thank you so much, Aleka, and to all the organizers at the Asia Society India. It's truly an honor and a pleasure to be moderating the first panel in this year's summer series, focusing on climate in South Asia. And since this is the inaugural session, we'd like to make this an orientation on where we've reached in the climate crisis today, beginning with an exploration of the term climate justice and the different narratives surrounding it, followed by an overview of the global landscape of climate cooperation and aid, and the different approaches to climate justice in the global north and the global south. We'll then move on to the historical political economy of climate justice, understanding how the history of colonialism and global inequalities in development have led us to where we are, and how the global north and south can balance the imperatives of collective action and coordination with the historical obligations that the developed world may have towards the developing world. And finally, we'd like to zoom in on the unique challenges and realities present in South Asia and how we can best address them. So this discussion will take about 40 minutes, followed by a Q&A round where you can pose your own questions directly to the panelists. You can also type in your questions into the chat through the debate and to the discussion, and I'll pose your questions to the panelists during the Q&A session. So without further ado, let's get started. So Kasia and Harjeet, to begin with, could you give us your understanding of the concepts of climate justice and climate debt? How relevant is the notion of climate justice in today's world? And what climate justice that you've encountered through your research and experiences? Maybe Kasia, starting with you, and followed by Harjeet.
Yeah, so thanks so much for that question, Tushar. And let me just say that I really appreciate the invitation from the Asia Society India to participate in this event. And I'm so excited to be in dialogue with Harjeet, whose work I just have a tremendous amount of respect for. So really looking forward to this conversation today. Yeah, I mean, in response to your question, the concept of climate justice is absolutely essential to, I think, all of the ways that we approach thinking about organizing our societies in South Asia and beyond today. And I think that this question of how we define what climate justice is also fundamental to how we define questions of justice today all around the world in general. And for me, a big part of this question of how to define what climate justice is about thinking about different scales of applications for and pursuing that justice. So, in a lot of conversations about what climate justice means in both the global north and global south, but especially as it relates to questions between them, um, climate justice is is used to refer to justice between states. So the global north owes a debt to the global south for the histories of emissions that have caused the climate crisis in the first place. And therefore, climate justice means essentially climate finance being paid from the north to the south. And we'll talk more about this as we go in our conversation today. But from my perspective, the question about how to define climate justice, it really essentially involves thinking beyond just that dichotomy of global north and global south. That within states, both in the global north and within the global south, um, it's really essential to think about how climate adaptation and mitigation are pursued, and that justice means thinking in sort of smaller containers. And, Harjeet is obviously an expert in this in a way that I'm not, but it's my sense that the climate justice movement also has come a really long way in the last, I don't know, decade or so in thinking more in more kind of refined ways about how we pursue justice within as well as between states. So that's, yeah.
Thank you, Kasia, and thank you, Tushar, and Asia Society for organizing and having a chance to be on the same panel with Kasia. A real pleasure. Let me just build on what Kasia said, and I totally agree. As he says, that the concept of climate justice has evolved in the last few years, particularly in the public space. Of course, us from the global south and climate justice movements have been talking about it for more than 35, 40 years, I would say, well before the convention was crafted. And there is no doubt that climate justice definition particularly looks at the systemic injustices. So it goes way beyond the symptom of the climate crisis and talks about how historical and systemic injustices are responsible of not only for the climate crisis but all the connected crises, be it the biodiversity crisis or look at the mass extinction that is connected to the kind of extraction we have done on this planet over the last few centuries, I would say, and how the inequality that now exists, and it's not just between developed and developing countries, within developed and within developing countries as well. So when we talk about climate justice, for us, it's a pivot to connect all other injustices as well and demand equitable solutions that address historical injustices, including the emissions that have caused these multiple crises in many ways, and how we can then address those vulnerabilities and respond to those systemic inequalities rather than treating it merely in a technical or environmental issue. I think that is important, and I also agree with Kasia. While we need to address the climate justice aspect between states, but how do we make sure that this definition expands and when it comes to practice, people who are vulnerable, both in the developed and developing countries, get justice? Because we are living in a world where it's, a few years we used to say 1% versus 99%. Now it is 0.1% versus the 99.9%. That's the kind of inequality we are seeing in the world. So how do we approach the concept of climate justice? That is really important. However, the challenge at the international level, what we find is that developed countries, as governments rather, still have a lot of resources which they are not sharing. As Kasia said, finance needs to flow from the global north to global south, as well as technology and capacity building, a lot of such support. And the challenge is that those institutions that were created are, whether we talk about the financial institutions or the trade regime, is still favoring the same extractive model of development and the same set of those large economies who industrialize first and who have the most responsibility in causing the climate crisis, yet they are doing very little. And rather, not only they pursuing the same extractive model back home, but also exporting it and thrusting it down on a developing country. So the challenge of fossil fuels, for example, which is the primary driver of climate crisis, continues to be our core contributor to the climate crisis, and we are massively dependent on it in terms of energy. And it's again the developed countries who are leading the charge of expanding fossil fuels. So we need to look at the historical context, at the same time connect it with what's going on in the world at this moment, but also making sure that the developing countries who have least contributed to the problem get the kind of support. Only then we'll be able to deal with the current situation. And that's where it connects with the climate debt question on how developed countries need to. And in fact, I would bring in corporations as well, and would love to hear from Kasia on, if you look at the number, we say that, of course, developed countries, whether we talk about the US, historically a quarter, even now until 2021, 1/5 of the contribution to greenhouse gases comes from the US, even if you blame, China and other countries for their emissions. That's the reality. But corporations, 100 corporations being responsible for more than 70% of emissions cumulatively is also something that we need to look at and as part of our climate justice approach. Let me stop here.
Thanks so much. That was a fantastic introduction to these concepts and highlighting many of the nuances that I think we'll explore through this discussion. But just before we get into the in the issues within the countries, as you mentioned, which I think are important in places as diverse as South Asia. I want to understand the global landscape in terms of climate action, and particularly how the thinking about climate action and justice has changed maybe in the past few years. We've seen a tumultuous few years, let's be honest, about with multiple international crises and global conflicts arising, and perhaps even a refocusing of priorities and funding from climate initiatives. So maybe Harjeet, starting with you, and then Kasia to follow. Could we discuss the role and the importance of international aid and cooperation in addressing climate justice? How have you seen the global landscape change in terms of climate action and climate justice in the past few years? And I understand that this isn't a simple dichotomy, but we do see, differences between, let's say, historically developed countries and countries that are industrializing or developing right now. How do narratives of climate justice differ between the global north and the global south? And to what extent do you think this impacts the climate aid and assistance?
Sure, Tushar. So when we talk about climate justice, or let's talk about the implementation of it, what does it really entail? It's about transfer of resources. It's about developed countries taking more responsibility of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, moving away from fossil fuels, and supporting developing countries. The fact is that rich countries not only failed on reducing their own emissions, if you look at them as a block, as per their fair share. And second, they have not provided the necessary finance, which is absolutely vital to support mitigation, adaptation, and now addressing loss and damage in developing countries. So in the UNFCCC, United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, as many of the participants would know, we have a concept called common but differentiated responsibility and respective capabilities, short form equity. So countries who have most responsibility and most capacity have the largest share of responsibility as well to act, which also means providing resources. And the first figure that popped up in 2009, and the target was set to provide $100 billion per year by 2020. Annually, that that target was achieved late, and second, majority of the money, about 70%, came as loans. Now it further exacerbates the debt crisis that many developing countries are already facing. And another challenge is that we always said this money has to be over and above, what we use the word new and additional in the climate lingo, to the existing aid commitment of 0.7% of GNI. Not just they included that as part of GNI. In fact, if we have the last few years we have seen, of course, I don't have to tell you about the USAID cut thanks to President Donald Trump, but even the UK has cut foreign aid from 0.7% to 0.5, which was actually a legal obligation. And that really impacts the flow, not only for climate, but for development. And of course, we should also talk about how climate action cannot happen without development as a foundation, right? And then even Netherlands and Sweden and other countries have followed suit, and they've reduced their own ODA, the Overseas Development Assistance. So the situation when it comes to aid in general and climate finance, which is not aid, which is, it's not part of just the cooperation, it's a responsibility that is not flowing. And the other challenge that we see, which is a narrative challenge, that global north countries think that carbon markets and technological fixes are going to solve the climate crisis, which we have not seen. I don't know what new technology we are going to develop in the next 20 years. We have we already have sufficient technical know-how to actually fix the climate crisis. What we are missing, and finance. Look at the money that's going to that went to COVID crisis. Of course, much required, but mostly serving the global north when it comes to resources from those countries. For when we had financial crisis, money was made available quickly, and of course now with these wars, we see hundreds of billions of dollars mobilized. So it's not lack of money. Uh, it's about the lack of intent and political will, which is really delaying the climate action. And look at where we are. We are living in a 1.6-degree warmer world.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more with everything that Harjeet said. I think that the scaling back of sort of legally recognized obligations to development in the context of the need for scaling up is um, absolutely a global crisis. Um, I also think that the point that he made about the focus on technological fixes is also really important. And so when I think about the landscape of climate finance and the way that it's layered on top of conditions of development aid today, I think about multiple different um, sort of planes of problems and inequalities. And that's because, I fully agree that these obligations need to be upheld. They're commitments that are based on long-standing, historical obligations that I know we'll get to more in a minute. But it is also the case that the way that those funds have been spent, up to this point, prior to the beginning of them being scaled back, has also been problematic. And so, when I look at, the sort of major concerns that we're all sort of like looking in horror at the cuts to USAID, the cuts to um, British development finance, like from all across the global north to the global south. I agree that that's a problem, and I also think that what was happening before with those funds was not great. And so when we think about like what do we do about what's happening now, it can't just be like we need to get those funds back so that we can, reinstate the technological fixes that were being celebrated for so long. There needs to be, in addition to this recognition of um, the need to fulfill these obligations, there needs to be a radical rethinking of the way that development is done. And sort of alongside that, there needs to be a radical rethinking of what that means for climate justice. And so, I mean, yeah, I guess the last thing that I wanted to say, and I think, we've been talking about climate justice in a way that's sort of undifferentiated between adaptation and mitigation, which I think certainly they're related to one another, especially as far as climate finance goes. But one of the things that I think about a lot when I think about this concept of um, new and additional that Harjeet mentioned, which I think is really important, is that there's sort of two sides of this. One is that there's development funding that has already been committed, and there's an obligation to give more for climate finance on top of that. And a lot of that is related to questions about what adaptation looks like. On the mitigation side, I think that there's sort of a flip side of new and additional that is really complex, which is different from the way that these sort of the lingo works, which is that a lot of the sort of new and additional finance for mitigation of fossil fuel emissions has actually gone into funding new renewable energy rollout alongside the existing emissions from fossil fuel energy. And so, some sort of like critical scholars um, of energy studies have been saying recently, we talk about these like huge investments in solar power and in other kinds of renewable energies. One of the major issues with that is that we're investing in renewable energy and not divesting from fossil fuels. And so what we're getting is just more and more energy and more emissions, which doesn't help the sort of bottom line that we're looking at.
Tushar, if I
Right.
if I
And
may come
Kasia,
in,
oh, please go ahead.
so I totally agree with Kasia, which is not making this discussion very interesting because we are agreeing with each other too much. But let me underline a very important point that Kasia made about rethinking of aid. And yes, ODI always had several issues. And coming from Global South, I can say that with a lot more emphasis, Kasia, to developing countries, and I've already started saying this is a good moment for us. While we all are affected, the sector is affected. We are seeing how communities who were dependent on even HIV related support or basic education and other health services, those are impacted because it happened all of a sudden and they were not prepared. Having said that, it is an opportunity for developing countries to rethink because this perpetual dependence of aid has not really delivered. Yes, we do talk about numbers that extreme poverty has gone down, but at what cost? It's not, the dependence has not really reduced. We have not been able to dealt with the structural problems of with the economy and trade. It's an important juncture to look at the trade rules once again. And I'm very pleased to see how Africa is really waking up to this reality. And because when we are talking about this transitioning away from fossil fuels, even as Kasia said, and I'll come to it, uh, fossil fuel expansion is happening, yes, but at the same time, the demand for critical minerals has increased, and everybody is looking to Africa, not earlier recognizing that 1 billion people don't have access to modern energy, or even in Asia, millions of people still are suffering from a lack of access to electricity and so on. So they're not looking at those challenges, but again, only looking at resources. So for countries to wake up and understand what resources they have and how exploitation has happened, and how we need to really redefine the relationship with the global north, and that's where also to your point, and this is where my role with the fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty comes in, where we are saying Paris Agreement is not able to deliver when it comes to moving away from fossil fuels. You are absolutely right. When I could have shown you the graphic that in the last 3 decades, our dependence on fossil fuels has barely changed from 80% to 80.5% to 80.3 to now 79%. All the renewable energy increase is feeding to the increased demand than displacing fossil fuels. And again, this is also a very structural problem involved with that. So yeah, thank you for raising that. Over to you, Tushar.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm tempted to introduce a note of discord between you two because you're agreeing so much. But I think there's broad consensus on what we need to do. But perhaps this might be an interesting question because Harjeet, you mentioned trade, which is a consequence of historical inequalities of development. And Kasia, you also talked a lot about the historical aspect of this. As we move on to the historical political economy, shall we say, of climate justice and debt, to what extent do you believe that historical processes, we can think about colonialism, we can think about the different times countries went through industrialization, still continue to shape climate issues today? I suppose, is there a need of a reckoning or recognition of the impact of these historical processes on our modern day problems, or are these just a distraction from the actions that we need to take? And the second part of that is, how do we balance the historical obligations, shall we say, of the developed world, of the global north to the global south? Um, how do we balance that with the necessity of the kind of collective action and shared responsibilities that I think is needed to tackle climate issues? Maybe Kasia, you can kick this one off and then followed by Harjeet.
Yeah, it's such a good question. And I mean, for me, these historical questions are absolutely fundamental to the way that we think about um, understanding what got us into this mess in the first place and also how we address it. So, um, in my field, a big part of the way that we think about environmental problems is about understanding the way that vulnerabilities are interpreted. And so, I think that a lot of very mainstream discourse on climate change and even some mainstream discourse on climate justice um, traces vulnerability to climate change to very proximate and also more kind of technical drivers. And so, in Bangladesh in particular, or sort of it sort of naturalizes climate risks. And so a really good example is in Bangladesh. Journalists love to talk about how Bangladesh is disproportionately vulnerable to climate change. And when they do so, they always write about, the poverty, the cyclones, and they basically say like this is a natural problem that Bangladesh is confronting just because of the sort of the funnel of the Bay of Bengal that brings cyclones here, and it's very hot. And to me, this is not only like a completely bereft understanding of what makes Bangladesh vulnerable to climate change, but it also has major implications for how we think about what the solutions to that climate vulnerability are. And so if we completely write history out of what shapes contemporary climate vulnerability, then the solutions that we offer to addressing that vulnerability are going to be band-aids, and they're going to entrench the problems that got us here in the first place. So, from my perspective, Bangladesh is vulnerable um, to climate change because of sort of long-standing historical processes that date to, in particular, to the colonial period, and also to sort of post-colonial development models that have continued these practices of extraction. In India as well, a close colleague of mine, Tanya Matan, who works in Madhya Pradesh, she writes about how we can only understand climate vulnerability for farmers through the particular kind of productivist and extractivist model of the Green Revolution that continues to be practiced today, and that has impacts that are unequally distributed across class, caste, and gender. And so I think that sort of instead of saying like we need to disentangle climate impacts from all of these other impacts, what we need to do is understand how they're completely intertwined with one another, and that sort of understanding the legacies of empire and exploitation due to these processes is what helps us to understand both what's happening and also what should be done about it.
Yeah, let me add to and unpack a few more points that Kasia mentioned. Of course, we know that colonial rule and the kind of extraction that happened during that fueled the industrialization, which was based on burning coal, oil, and gas, and that's an important aspect, which got them wealth. And at the same time, there was a direct extraction of wealth. And if we talk about South Asia, there's a well-established study by economist Utsa Patnaik and published by Columbia University Press that British took a total of $45 trillion from the Indian subcontinent, if you compare that with the current cost, which is actually more than 13 times of the current UK GDP. So it's important to understand the scale of money that was taken. And as Kasia said, now that left the region and particularly countries like Bangladesh far more vulnerable. So their capacity to adapt is fundamentally impacted. And I would like to point your audience to a study done by Carbon Brief. So first they did on historical emissions in 2021, and then they actually brought a layer of colonial emissions. And it's very interesting. If you read that, you'll find that the moment you bring that layer, the French share of historical emissions rise by half, and for UK it doubles, and for Netherlands and Portugal it triples. So the responsibility is much higher, and for India, which is now seen as a punching bag because of the large population and emissions, the responsibility actually falls by 15%. For Indonesia, it goes down by 24%. So look at the amount of additional burden that colonialism has put on countries, at the same time draining resources and now hindering their capacity and to deal with climate impact. So it's much deeper. That's the point I'm trying to make, just building on what Kasia said, that the impact of colonialism still continues. And those colonial institutions continue to thrive. So we are still, that's why we keep calling it neo-colonialism. So it's not just a phrase or a buzzword. It's a reality that we are living with.
Fantastic. And I think, if the audience also has any questions or wants to dive a little bit deeper, because so many of these topics are very fascinating, they require a panel of themselves to discuss. Please ask questions on it. We can get into that in the Q&A session. But, as we're running off the end of this discussion part of it, the panel, I'd like to come to South Asia specifically. And I realize we may have touched upon some of these topics in your previous answers, but I'd like to understand, how do we think about climate justice in South Asia specifically? In terms of what are the unique challenges and conditions that differ from previous or conventional approaches and narratives in the global north or even in other developing nations? And to what extent are these approaches applicable to the South Asian context? Or do you think that we need to develop indigenous solutions or indigenous approaches to South Asia's problems? And maybe as we wrap this panel up, the panelists have extensive amounts of experience in research work. Maybe you can share some of the solutions and success cases that you've seen through your time. So maybe Harjeet, starting with you, and then followed by Kasia.
Sure. Kasia has also done quite a bit of work in South Asia, so she can share her experience. Of course, we already covered the historical context. Uh, if you look at where we are, South Asia is a disaster hotspot. In the entire Asia, particularly South Asia, the dependence on agriculture. So we are still a primarily agrarian economy. Even a large country like India has 50% of its people dependent on agriculture directly, indirectly. Per capita, if you look at, still our emissions are very low. There are massive urban and rural disparities. At the same time, we have a large young population. Just to set the context, that's where we live, and we have all sizes of economies from India to Maldives to Bhutan to Laos and so on. And you talk about the kind of impacts, you name it, and we have it in the region. From droughts to floods to glacier melt to now the new challenges of sea level rise and so on. Um, and at the same time, we have our own challenges. Although I would argue, and there's enough evidence seeded by British, look at what happened between India and Pakistan recently. And when Kashmir becomes an issue, I know we are talking of climate, but we're also talking about the region. Uh, the reality is that we have not resolved that. So, on one hand, we need to address those historical inequalities, but I would also put the onus on our own governments that you can do better, right? Recognize the historical inequalities. I'm not saying, erase those. That's an important context, but there's a lot that we can do now. I keep challenging my own country that why are we blindly following the same extractive model which has brought so many crises? Look at the waste management challenge in a country like India. Yes, we are doing very good on renewable energy, and I really commend the speed that we have picked up over the last few years, and there's a clear political commitment to that. But the same commitment doesn't apply to environmental protection in general. Look at the air pollution that we face. Despite knowing how deep the problem is, we are only looking at it very superficially, and a long way to go. Our infrastructural expansion really affects our green cover and the way forest clearances are given. So we have not created our own model, and I would not blame anybody but our own governments for that, right? I think we are well aware and to come up with our own models based on our own context. So I think that challenge remains, where we take into account the historical context, but we could have really taken a shift and demonstrated that we are different. And while there are some positive examples, and I can come to that, but let me pass it on to Kasia.
Um, yeah, I agree with that again, unfortunately. Um, I think that so there are sort of several aspects to your question. One is about just like what do we do moving forward in general, and then what can we learn about these kinds of solutions in relation to specific sort of South Asian histories. And I think that in response to the first part and also sort of like drawing on your last question, I think that there is an important role, and in particular in South Asia, for thinking about climate finance as a kind of reparations, which is very different from thinking of climate finance as like a charity from the global north to the global south. And so reparations would mean thinking specifically about past harms and the way that they manifest in the present, and understanding climate justice as a way of addressing those past harms, I think is a really important move that South Asia is uniquely positioned to sort of lead. Next, I think that it's also really important to think about the negative impacts of solutions that are being called climate solutions that are already in place. So, in my own research in Bangladesh, I've seen plenty of projects that are funded by climate finance that are being called, solutions to addressing climate vulnerability that have disadvantaged the people who are already most disadvantaged. So one really clear example in my own work is the use of shrimp aquaculture as a climate change adaptation strategy, which has been absolutely catastrophic for people, for poor farmers, and especially landless laborers in the coastal region. This idea that, farming is no longer viable, and therefore we can just sort of wipe out these massive rice paddies, has been ecologically destructive, and it has displaced probably millions of people. So that's something that we also see sort of like emerging on the Indian side of the Sundarbans that I think is worth being very, very careful about. That like not all climate solutions are good solutions for all people. Um, but then I guess the other thing that I would say then is that Bangladesh, or South Asia in general, Bangladesh and India, all across the subcontinent, there's a long history of social movements that are already specifically sort of excellent at and equipped to address these histories of unequal resource distribution. And so, I could name so many of them. Um, in India, it would be like trite to just start naming them. I'm sure you could think of many yourself that I couldn't even think of. But these are conversations not just about saying we want to demand something for India from the global north, but more specifically saying within India, within the global south, we also recognize that this unequal resource distribution that is in part a legacy of empire also means that we have a responsibility to grapple with this inequality domestically. And so addressing those politics means thinking about justice and situating that version of what it means to think about justice firmly within our understanding of climate justice is really important. So, land redistribution, for example, land justice is climate justice. Gender justice is climate justice. Caste justice is climate justice. And, I think that that's not like my own analysis. It's something that I've learned from political movements in South Asia, that we all could continue to learn more about.
Right. So, Harjeet, do you have any response? Or if not, then we can move on directly to the Q&A section.